Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I make it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. Listeners, as many of you will know, I started this podcast back in 2018 with a view to showcasing Australian stories and local writing talent. It felt important to me as an Australian to be reading and supporting stories that are birthed here or by people with a strong connection to this country. Our stories reflect our identity, and they can help us understand experiences and journeys that are not our own, help us empathise with and acknowledge different points of view, and open our minds to the kind of Australia we want to pass on to our children and the generations that follow. Stories that examine what it means to be Australian. This is a question that runs through the heart of my next guest's novel. It's called Chai Time at Cinnamon Gardens, published by Ultimo Press earlier this year, and it's written by Shankari Chandran, and I'm delighted to welcome Shankari to the podcast this morning to chat about this wonderful new novel. Hi, Shanks.
Good morning, Claudine. Thank you so much for having me today.
I'm so delighted to have you. This interview's been a while in the making, hasn't it?
It has, but well worth the wait for both of us.
Indeed. Well, I hope you think so by the end of this.
You notice how I presumptuously said it's going to be worth the wait for you? She says, hopefully.
I absolutely think it will be. This novel, Shankari, was engrossing, rich, and utterly enchanting. A poignant read from start to finish, I have to say. I wanted to know if you could tell me a little bit more about the story and why or how you were inspired to write it.
Two questions there. So Chai Time at Cinnamon Gardens follows the lives of a group of residents and staff at a nursing home set in a fictional suburb in Western Sydney. It's set against the backdrop of rising racism in contemporary Australia, but it flashes back to these residents' lives in their ancestral homeland of Sri Lanka, which they fled during the war. It's about the stories that the residents and staff tell each other and themselves, really, the stories we tell ourselves to keep our memories and our culture alive and to stop it from being eroded by dispossession, by migration, and by aging. So in terms of what prompted me to tell the story, there's the sort of the location itself is a nursing home, right? And I used to visit my grandmother before COVID. Now it is much harder due to COVID. But the nursing home Cinnamon Gardens is set on a real life nursing home in Western Sydney, where my grandmother lives. And I used to visit her with my 4 children. And when we did this, Claudine, she would tell us the most beautiful stories of her life, beautiful and entertaining and sometimes scandalous. And then she would tell us the stories, perhaps far too many stories, of the other residents in the nursing home, because they had known each other back home, as they say, in Sri Lanka. And in any room of a nursing home, there will be up to 4 generations, sometimes 5, because people were having children so much younger back then. And they're telling these stories and learning and fighting and laughing and listening. And I thought, what a beautiful place where generations transfer knowledge and information and culture and memory. And what a beautiful place in which to set a story. Now, initially, I thought I would write a whimsical tale full of wit and warmth with eccentric nursing home characters, because certainly my grandmother and her friends are as eccentric as, perhaps I and my friends are. I just pay more attention at the nursing home. But what I also have known for decades is that I wanted to write about race. And I have not felt comfortable in the past to do that, did not feel brave enough to do that. And I think I'm at that stage in my career, or I eventually felt that I was at that stage in my career and my maturity as a writer in order to try to grapple that issue, because I've been struggling with that and identity and the need for home throughout my life. And so that desire to write about race and identity converged with the setting of the nursing home, and the outcome was Chai Time at Cinnamon Gardens.
You've alluded to this already, but quite an important thread in this story is the dispossession and violence against Tamils in Sri Lanka. I had very little understanding of the civil war in Sri Lanka and the circumstances that led to the anti-Tamil riots in July of 1983 and the violence that followed. The background of that in this story gave Chai Time at Cinnamon Gardens quite a personal flavour for me. Is that how you felt about it? It was personal?
I think all writing is personal, and for so many of us, writing is catharsis. We are working through the issues of our families and of our lives. And this novel and my first novel, Song of the Sun God, which Ultimo Press will publish later this year, they will republish it, which is just such a wonderful gift to me from the universe, because both those novels really explore the history and the struggle of the Tamil people in Sri Lanka, and then their search for home when they were forced to flee Sri Lanka. And when you connect that to the stories of Sri Lankan Tamils in Australia, and we see the Billawila family, for example, that Australians have just, embraced and advocating for so profoundly, and the disconnect between what Australians want for that family and what politicians are willing to give that family, what the government is willing to give that family. I think all novels that explored those issues help to contextualize who we are today as a country and how we should be treating migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, and people seeking to create home here. So yes, it was immensely personal, and perhaps particularly so because so many of those issues of justice around the war and the ending of the war, its culmination and then its ending. So many of those issues of justice were never properly adjudicated in Sri Lanka. They were never adjudicated in international courts. And the world watched what was happening. And some countries intervened actually in order to assist the government. And many countries stepped back, and through their lack of intervention and their indifference, they were also complicit in the genocide that took place. And as part of that diaspora, as a group of people that was so fortunate to have fled before all of that happened, we live with this incredible gratitude and guilt about it. And we want that story to be told. We want it not to be buried.
We learn about what happened in Sri Lanka through Maya and Zakia's story. So I wanted to know, what research did you do to be able to write this part of the story?
So it's interesting that when I get asked this research question about Chai Time at Cinnamon Gardens, because with Chai Time at Cinnamon Gardens, I felt like all of my previous novels had actually been training for this novel. I'm speaking to an old school friend of mine. I've known her since we were 8, and I've been telling her that I want to be an author since I was 8. And she said when she read Chai Time at Cinnamon Gardens and compares it to the first draft of Song of the Sun God, right? So the first draft, not the 30th draft, but the first draft, because she's one of my oldest friends. So she gets, I impose a first draft on her, which you quickly learn as a writer. Don't do that. Don't give your first draft to people. Think about it.
Tip for later. Okay.
Yes. And she just said the writing is at a completely different level. And that's because from that first draft of that first novel in 2012, I've been learning to write, I've been learning to research, and I've been accumulating a body of knowledge and experience and stories that are finding their way into each of my novels, but most importantly, this third one, Chai Time at Cinnamon Gardens. And so on that research question, I had actually done most of my research for Song of the Sun God, which actually turns out was for Chai Time at Cinnamon Gardens as well. And I was really well versed in the history of Sri Lanka, and in particular, I was really well versed in the history of Sri Lanka because there's 70 critical years from independence to the end of the war. And for this novel, what I really needed to do more was to think very deeply about the connection between what happened in Sri Lanka and what is happening in Australia, and the parallels between the ways in which political authorities and governments and colonizers appropriate and take control of a historical narrative about the way a country is founded in order to create a story about who owns that country and who has the right to be there and who does not have the right to be there, because that's exactly what has happened in Australia. And so it was when I had that moment of, it was a literal aha. I could see light bulbs above my head when I just thought, oh, wow, my ancestral homeland of my parents and my chosen homeland of Australia that I love so deeply are actually grappling with the same issue. And it affects in Australia, most importantly, how we treat our First Nations people. And it also affects deeply how we affect new people, in particular people of color, coming to this country for generations, even the first generations, my parents and your parents, who came perhaps in the 70s or earlier. My parents could only come in the 70s after the White Australia policy had ended. That foundation of this country, of the modern nation state of Australia, and how we tell that story to ourselves affects everything, including how we are all treated. So that was where I spent a lot of my research time, thinking and researching and reading. And then, of course, trying to overcome that sense that I didn't have the ability, I didn't have the intellect or the language or the words to try to deliver that, that terrible thing that we do to ourselves, that terrible inner critic, that voice that just won't stop talking. So I spent a lot of time researching and thinking myself out of that box.
Yeah, that was so interesting. And as I explained to you before we started recording, that was the part of this story that really resonated with me the most. As a child of migrant parents myself, it is something that, made me reflect on, as I said, what it means to be Australian and how that is playing out now in terms of the way that we think about migrant Australians, how we think about refugees, how we think about unification as one country, one people. There was so much in this book to unpack: cultural dispossession, colonisation, and cultural erasure, as you mentioned, along with self-determination. Despite you saying that you didn't think you had the language to talk about it, you did it in such an eloquent and such an accessible way, I thought. It does give us pause to think about what it means to be Australian right now. And you've explored this in a range of different platforms and views in the book, via the press, via politicians, and on Twitter. Not all of which I think paint a particularly flattering view of Australians. There's a lot going on there, isn't there?
And there is. And, I hope that I've given a well-rounded view of Australians, because all of those nursing home residents are Australians too. Yeah. We're all Australian, and we hold a range of political opinions and perspectives, and how we manifest them, it can be different, varied, and at times questionable. And one of the other questions that this book asks, I think, and I will come back to what you are talking about, but I do want to say that one of the things that this book does ask of us is that, how can we make space for each other respectfully? How can we allow that multiplicity of identities, and also that multiplicity of perspectives on politics, on policies, on everything, to coexist in a way that is respectful, that is loving, that is nurturing and cohesive and unified? Because fundamentally, all of the characters in that book actually want the same things for themselves and their children. And so, going back to my perspective, or how I've painted Australians, I think I definitely took this novel as an opportunity and a platform from which to critique a very powerful narrative that exists, a powerful rhetoric that exists within Australia. And it was quite freeing for me to do that, because I think when you see it in the public space, when you see that political narrative about race and the way in which it is effectively framed in order to exclude certain kinds of people, or to critique and vilify the behaviors of certain kinds of people as un-Australian or not Australian enough, when other people then try to critique those people back, right, or try to interrogate that commentary, they are the people who've made the initial commentary really use that sort of right to freedom of speech as a shield to protect themselves. But when people attempt to explore what they've said, those same people that were the bastions of freedom of speech then attack the right to freedom of speech of their critiquers, or their critics rather. Yeah. And so it deteriorates very quickly into a dialogue, not even a dialogue, into a sort of public narrative that isn't constructive. And I, in part because I would like to think that I have a sense of humor, I wanted to use those different platforms such as social media and the ways in which certain, shock jocks and talk show hosts and journalists speak and marshal and harness those platforms to rile up people. I wanted to critique it, but through humor, because if you try to do it in the public space, you then face that same vilification, right? They will come for you. But I don't know why I felt safer to do it from from the distance of a novel, and almost, taking that narrative very close to satire. And I found it very entertaining and equally galling, because I didn't have to fictionalize the narrative, that extreme narrative. I just had to Google a few people and a few incidents in our history, and that language of what it means to be Australian, and the maliciousness, the viciousness with which those people then attack others, was very easy to find, and I just had to paraphrase it.
I was going to say that it's not anything that hasn't actually happened in our history, and it's certainly something that's happened in recent memory. Yeah, it was such an interesting way of probing a very sore tooth in Australian social dynamic. This might be a hard question to answer, but I wondered, do you think that we know what it means to be Australian, or is it more that there are different views depending on the colour of our skin?
I'll try not to ramble with this answer because, we could have a whole podcast about that, right?
Yes, yeah.
Preferably with a cup of tea. I think the beauty of being Australian, and just the beauty of being human, is that there are so many of us, and so many differences, and so many unifying commonalities. And simultaneously, there is the capacity for there to be union within difference. So we don't actually have to all be the same in order to be unified.
Yeah.
And we don't all have to be the same in order to have a collective identity, a shared identity. And I think I have enormous hope and faith in us, in our species, and in Australians, that we can create that space for each other. And so when I think about what it means to be Australian, what I think about is that we come from a rich and profound civilization, that this land was once owned by, and still is owned by, a rich and profound group of civilizations, in fact, group of peoples, the longest continuous civilization in the world. And that we don't learn enough from that, and we don't acknowledge it enough. And there's still time for us to do better on that. Yeah. I also think that this is a place that has offered refuge to everybody, from the first fleet to the last fleet and to the ongoing fleets. And a place of refuge is a wonderful place of love. And with that in mind, we have it within us to create space for all of us. And so that's, to me, what it means to be Australian. And within that, there are so many experiences, stories, voices, histories, and perspectives. But it's the space that counts. And this is a land of boundless plains to share, is it not? And so I think we have it in us to make that space.
Your characters at Cinnamon Gardens, we have some wonderful characters, a wonderful collection of residents and staff members, many of whom carry some quite sad stories, some legacies of trauma from time spent in the war and the terrible things that happened to them. But Maya in particular was a fabulous character, and I loved being a try-hard novelist myself. I love that she was a novelist.
We're all trying hard, Claudine.
Some of us are more successful than others, let me tell you.
But
I loved that she was a novelist. But her inability to publish stories about her country and people says a great deal about the state of the publishing industry, doesn't it?
Yes, and that experience that Maya goes through was very much my opportunity to not unkindly, I hope, put down on paper my own experiences when I was trying to get published in Australia about 10 years ago now. And so when I wrote my first novel, Song of the Sun God, which, as I mentioned earlier, Ultimo will publish later this year, Claudine, it was a story about 3 generations of Australian Tamil women and the choices that they make to survive Sri Lanka's civil war. And it was about dispossession and forced migration, about colonization and war, and about the search for home, the creation of home in Australia. And I was told when I sent that book out that you have beautiful characters, you write so well, but the story is just not Australian enough. And we won't be able to sell it in Australia. Australians won't want to read this. It's not an Australian story. And it really grieved me. I felt genuine grief because it was in a sense, a reminder of my place in this country. And I was deeply hurt by that. And really, when you think about a story that's about colonization, dispossession, and the search for home, what could be more Australian,
I
right?
was going to say the exact same thing.
It's like, isn't that the definition of modern day Australia? So I was very hurt by that. And I went on to write another novel, which I then ended up changing the color of my protagonist in that novel, the second novel, The Barrier. His name was in fact Zakir Ali. And I changed his name and his color and his character from being Zakir Ali to being Noah Williams. I made him from brown to white as a response to that, because I thought, well, I really want to get published, and my home won't publish me in the way that I write. So let me compromise. By the time I wrote Chai Time at Cinnamon Gardens, I again had grown, I hope, and evolved. And I'd been working with a lot of South Asian writers and had become more comfortable in my own skin and more confident of my own voice. And I also just figured, you know what, I'm probably never going to get published again in Australia, or ever. So let me just write like no one's going to read this novel. And so I wrote it with full candor. I wrote it with honesty, and therefore, in it, I explored the experiences that I had had through Maya, and had a lot of fun with the types of novel genres that she then plays with in order to get published in Australia, including a children's book, I think, with a koala as the protagonist called Barry, named after my friend Barry down the road and his pocket full of gum nuts. I think it's important to have fun with the difficult experiences of one's life. And certainly, Chai Time at Cinnamon Gardens, there's plenty of trauma, but I do hope there's also plenty of fun.
Indeed, the irony of the entire situation. It's not lost on me.
Thanks, Claudine.
I absolutely love it. Now, we had a bit of a conversation before we started recording about food. Now, there's a really strong thread about Sri Lankan food in this novel, which I found incredibly fascinating. But one character has particular issue with that. And so talk me through that and about what it means to be normal.
And thank you for that question. And I'm definitely coming around to your house for Easter, because I think your food sounds as delicious as ours. And in Chai Time at Cinnamon Gardens, and in our cultures and communities, food is a very rich part of our lives, and it's how we show our children and our families that we love them, is by the food that we make for them. And equally, it is just like for all of us, it is something we do and eat and make and wash up afterwards every single day. It is our normal. And so in Chai Time at Cinnamon Gardens, I use food as a device with which to explore what it means to be normal and who gets to decide what normal is. And so there is a character, a white Australian character in the book, who takes real umbrage, takes real offense at the kind of food that is prepared at the nursing home for the residents, who are predominantly Tamil. The food that's provided in the nursing home is Tamil food, it's Greek food, it's a tailored menu depending on who's eating. So Maya prepares a menu or designs a menu for her residents. It's based on their culture and their ancestry. And what she says is that she wants them to feel and to know that at the end of their lives, they are as loved as they were at the beginning of their lives. And she does that through food. And to Gareth, this food is exotic and it's questionable, and he wants to know why the nursing home is providing it, and why can't they simply provide sandwiches and sausage rolls and pasta, or whatever it is that he considers normal, because what he considers normal, he considers acceptable. Yeah. And in this, the conversation that I want the book, one of the conversations that I would love this book to have with people, is about who gets to decide what's normal, and to challenge and question the way in which we all assert and impose our own lived experience as the universal experience. And what this novel tries to do, what I've tried to do in it, I hope successfully, is try to make you think about that, and to show you that I have reorientated, or in fact, it's not even a reorientation for me.
Mm.
I have simply allowed myself to orientate my novel, my characters, their lives, my style of writing around my own lived experience, which is my normal. And there are a billion South Asians. The global South is larger than the global North. And our experience, whilst actually admittedly is in no way homogenous, right? South Asia is so many countries and India itself is so many cultures and languages. So there's no homogeneity there at all. And yet, and for each of us, our experience is our own and it is our own universal. And in Australia, I want us to challenge what it is that we assert as universal. I want us to think about the fact that about 234 years ago, brown people and the multiplicity of experiences of the different nations of First Nations Australia and Australians or peoples was normal and universal. And X number of ships arrive and change that radically and almost irrevocably, and assert a different kind of normal and universal, built actually on notions of supremacy of their race. And then other people come to this country with different lived experiences, which to us are normal, and yet somehow are positioned less than, lower than, different from, exotic to that white Australian normal. And I want to talk about that again in a way that's loving and respectful and allows people to see that we are each our own normal.
Yeah, it was just such an eye-opening. I mean, it was not eye-opening to me in the sense that I didn't think that already, but it was just so refreshing and wonderful to see it in a story like Chai Time at Cinnamon Gardens. And just the cool and very calm, collected way in which Maya and her daughter were able to just deflect all of Gareth's concerns and answer them with rationality. And he just came across, unfortunately, as being quite irrational in his opposition.
Yeah, I was telling a friend recently that, the first time I ate a steak was when I went to a friend's house it was in high school, in the early years of high school. The parent presented me with a piece of meat and vegetables. And, I'm not actually trying to stereotype or play to, suburban 1980s Australian tropes, right? I'm really not. I literally was presented with this food. And nowadays I enjoy a good steak, don't get me wrong. But at the time I was curious and fascinated, and we didn't even eat beef as a family, but I ate it because I didn't know what this brown piece of meat was. And I then went home and said to my mother, Amma, Amma, their food is so unusual, because it was to me. And so in this novel, not to spend too much time on food, although you can never spend too much time on food.
Indeed.
The food is simply a device and a way of exploring that concept and those competing concepts.
Yeah, absolutely. It was so well done. Thank you. Shankari, I found the title to be fascinating. It was what I felt to be a bit of a poke a bit of fun at our lack of comprehension of terms that many of us use in everyday language but don't actually understand what they mean. Chai is the Hindi word for tea, but incidentally, it's also broadly the same word in Arabic and in Greek.
Is that right?
It is. It is.
So good.
But many of us actually use it redundantly. For example, chai tea. And I'm guessing that wasn't an accident on your part.
Exactly. In fact, I think Maya at some point, in fact, Sarah Burns, I think in her Twitter feed, she just writes back to someone and says, there's no such thing as TT. And in fact, a Sri Lankan asked me recently at a book, at an author talk, why did I put chai in the title? We don't use that word. It's like, yes, but if you read the novel, you'll see that it was an ironic use of that word, because we don't use that word and it is frequently used incorrectly. And look, I'm again just having fun, right? I'm a hypocrite, Claudine, because I use all kinds of expressions in my language from Yiddish, because of my dear friend Terry. I use a smattering of multiple South Asian languages because I have friends from everywhere. So in any one sentence, I might, use Hindi and Gujarati and Tamil, just a word here and a word there, potentially incorrectly. So please understand that I come, open and aware of my own hypocrisy in relation to this, and equally willing to make fun of other people about it. And so what it's about is, on a very deeper level, in relation to colonization, India was never one country until colonization. And so the nation state of India is in fact a colonial construct. And the language of Hindi is often, within India, there is this kind of assertion of the North over the South, right? The South is always vying for its identity and its place. And as Tamils, we are ethnically aligned from Sri Lanka with Southern India. Southern Indians will churlishly say, look, Hindi is not the only language, okay? There's 100 million Tamil speakers out here. So there is this kind of internal conflict that goes on around language and the use of language and the universalizing of Hindi as the language of India. And then outside of South Asia, there is this conflict that goes on about the way in which the Western understanding of South Asia and the Western exoticization of South Asia and the use of elements of our culture, whether it be chai, and these complicated chais that you now see in shops, or whether it be, what we sometimes would consider an appropriation of yoga and so on. And some of these things are very good things, right? You can never have too much mindfulness. And the fact that Western civilization has really propagated mindfulness thinking is a good thing. The fact that they've commoditized it is something that South Asians are probably thinking, why didn't we learn to do that first? Okay. If South Asia had produced an app on mindfulness, god damn, that would have been so much money. So, so you do actually have to have fun with this. Yeah. And equally, and therefore I have enjoyed sort of playing with this idea of how in the West, the Westerners perceive, or the West, which in itself is a social construct, the way the West perceives South Asia and then communicates its perception of us back to ourselves. And then the fact that, therefore, when a yoga teacher might namaste my father would be thoroughly confused by this, because for starters, namaste is it's not our language, right? We would say vanakkam. And then secondly, he's a Hindu scholar, so he actually knows what the act of placing your hands together, holding it close to your heart means. And he'd be thinking, that's interesting. Do you know what that means? Let's have a talk about that, because he loves to talk about Hinduism. So we have a very different reaction to those things, to the way that two white people, for example, might experience namasteing each other.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. So was that title something that you came up with, or was it the publisher's idea?
So that was my original title, and I, you need a working title for a project, right? And that was my working title. I had received wonderfully some funding from Create New South Wales and from the Blake Beckett Scholarship Trust to write Chai Time at Cinnamon Gardens. And so, shout out to any philanthropists and any government willing to throw more money, please, behind the arts. It's so important.
Indeed,
for the development of the arts. And I had needed to give them a working title. And remember, I said I was sort of toying between writing a quirky novel set in a nursing home versus exploring race, and could I do it both at the same time? And so Chai Time at Cinnamon Gardens just seemed like a snappy title. And then when I got to the end of writing the novel and giving it to my agent, and I had this discussion with my agent and then eventually with my publisher, the title is misleading. And the cover is so pretty that it is also misleading. It's a beguiling cover, which the artist Jess Cruikshank totally nailed. And I had said to them, look, do we want to actually align the title and the cover, or the title a little bit more with the darker, deeper themes that the book explores? And, when I first, as I was developing the novel, I did think to myself, if I write a novel that is presented as a hard-hitting, darker novel that explores the big issues of Australia, actually a lot of readers won't pick it up. And certainly not with the name S. Chandran is at the bottom, where they don't really know who I am. And, it isn't a white Australian name. And so in the end, what I had hoped to do, and what the publisher really backed me on, was creating a kind of Trojan horse effect where you look at that title and think, oh, that's kind of quirky. And you look at the cover and you think, oh, that's really pretty. You pick it up because you might not otherwise have picked it up had I told you that, it's a searing critique of life in contemporary Australia. That was my sort of best Stan Grant voice. And you pick it up, you read it, and by page 20, you're like, oh, there's much more happening here than I thought.
Are you working on something else at the moment?
I am working on a novel at the moment. A few years ago, I created a character who called Ellie Ryder, and I wrote a political thriller for her. And that manuscript sat in a drawer. And then I wrote a short story for Ellie Ryder. And that short story actually made its way to Larissa Berendt. And Larissa Berendt and I are in the very early stages of developing that, into a TV adaptation with Dragonnet Films. And then I had another idea for Ellie Ryder, and who actually has subsequently been renamed Ellie Clancy. And I am pursuing that idea. I'm developing that idea for Ellie, and it is a political thriller set in Australia, and it explores the intersection of Ellie's life with another woman who is incarcerated. And it is about, it explores themes of the roles of government in people's lives, the intervention of governments in people's lives, and the ways in which communities actually work to help those individuals. And it explores the ways in which these two women empower each other and free each other from the constraints that society has placed on them. I appreciate I did not make that sound very interesting at all, Claudine, but I'm still working on it. My elevator pitch will get better the next time we speak.
Shankari, given all of your experiences in the publishing industry to date, I wondered if you had any tips that you could offer for aspiring authors out there who listen to this podcast.
Any tips that I have to offer come purely from a place of making so many mistakes in quick succession. With publishing, I would say absolutely put your best draft forward, whether it be approaching an agent or whether it be approaching publishers. Really challenge whether you think your manuscript is ready or not, and be prepared to send it to people. Find good people who will honestly interrogate that manuscript with you and for you, so that when you send it out, you are sure that this is the best work you could possibly produce. Because publishers and agents, particularly if you're an emerging author and you don't have an agent already, they won't look at things twice, or they very rarely will look at things twice. I would say write every day if you can. And I think that's really hard. And I certainly have ignored that advice for the last month between school holidays and my other job. But I find when I write every day, it's meditative for me. It's really therapeutic for me. The writing always gets better. Everything I write gets better by writing more. And it creates a flow that has an energy of its own. And so the more you write, the better you get. And then remember that everything you write, you can edit and fix later. And that has been very freeing for me to remember that, because I think we place a huge amount of pressure on ourselves to get it right first time round. And we are our own worst critics on that. And if you allow yourself the freedom to fail, the freedom to write whatever, and recognize that you can go back to it as many times as you need, as many times as you want, and you can make it better, then that will free you just to sit down and write in the first place.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing those wonderful tips.
You are welcome.
Shankari, this book has given me much to think about, and I appreciated the complexities and thought-provoking look at Australian society through the eyes of a tender and compassionate community at Cinnamon Gardens. Thank you for a wonderful read, and thank you for joining me on Talking Aussie Books this morning.
Claudine, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for reading the book and valuing it and seeing it, for seeing these issues and for wanting to talk to me about them. I love your podcast, and I love what you do. I love that you create this important platform for Aussie writers. So thank you.
That's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please drop me a line via my webpage, at claudinetinellis.com via Instagram, Facebook or Twitter. Alternatively, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or Google Podcasts. Until next time, happy reading!